What happens when a police officer mocks prayer only to become a medical mystery herself? Officer Deborah Williams thought she was upholding the law when she arrested Pastor Marcus and shut down a small church for praying too loudly. But just as she celebrated her victory, her body began to change in terrifying, unexplainable ways: swelling, rashes, fear, and voices in the night. Doctors were baffled. Tests came back normal. No diagnosis. No cure. Until something happened that medical science couldn't explain. As soon as Deborah stepped out of her police car, she heard it. Ryup. The zipper of her police ski jacket had burst open. She froze in place, eyes wide. Her stomach, flat just yesterday, was now bulging outward like a balloon filled with air. She tried to zip up her jacket, but it was impossible. The skin under her blouse looked tight, stretched, almost glowing red. As if that wasn't enough, red rashes began spreading across her arms and legs like wildfire. They crawled over her like an angry vine. Deborah gasped and tried to cover her arms, but it was already too late. People on the street stopped and stared. Phones came out. Someone whispered, "Isn't that the officer who shut down the church last week?" "Yes," someone else muttered. "That's her." Some pointed. Others whispered behind hands. The top police officer who had been arresting Christians for praying too loudly was now standing in the middle of the street with her body covered in rashes, her uniform tearing, and fear in her eyes. And what happened next shook everyone. Deborah was a very strict police officer in Riverside Town, a bustling city known for law, order, and silence. She was tough, and she was feared. When people saw her in uniform, they quickly looked away or crossed the street. Even her fellow officers were careful around her. She followed every rule. She enforced every law. Nothing was too small for her attention. But what most people didn't know was that Deborah had grown up in a deeply religious home. Her grandmother, a gentle woman with silver hair and warm hands, used to take her to church every Sunday. Little Deborah would sit on her lap and listen to stories from the Bible, stories about faith, kindness, and forgiveness. Those days were long gone now. Now, Deborah believed in one thing: control. She didn't trust prayer. She didn't trust emotions. To her, feelings were for the weak. Order was strength. Discipline was safety. But what was happening to her body now? None of her rules could stop it. None of her training prepared her for this. Was it a disease? Was it stress? Or was it something else? One thing was certain. This was only the beginning. Deborah had always taken pride in being the most feared officer in Riverside. She wore her badge like armor and carried her authority like a sword. She didn't care what people thought of her, as long as they followed the rules. But what happened the day she arrested Pastor Marcus was something even she didn't expect. It started with a noise complaint. A call had come in from a resident near Pine Street. "They're praying too loud again," the woman had said. "Every night, shouting and singing like it's a concert. Can't sleep. My kids are crying." Deborah picked up the assignment immediately. "Enough is enough," she muttered as she grabbed her coat and holstered her sidearm. Church or not, there are laws in this city. When she arrived at the small building on the corner, she could already hear the voices. Not screaming or yelling, but loud, passionate. People clapping, singing, and calling on God. Deborah's face tightened as she marched toward the door. Inside, about 30 people were on their knees, eyes closed, hands lifted. A few were crying, others were singing. The air was heavy with emotion. At the front stood Pastor Marcus, a kind-faced man in his early 50s, wearing a simple gray suit and holding a small Bible. Deborah didn't wait. "This gathering is in violation of noise regulations. You've had 3 warnings. You're under arrest for disturbing the peace." Gasps filled the room. The singing stopped. A woman in the back began to pray louder. Deborah turned and barked, "Quiet." But Pastor Marcus didn't move. "Officer, we're just praying. We mean no harm." "I said you're under arrest. Hands behind your back." One of the women stepped forward. "Please, officer. We're only here because we have nowhere else to go. This is our comfort." Deborah rolled her eyes. "Your comfort is disturbing the neighborhood. You can pray quietly at home." Before they could plead further, she placed handcuffs on the pastor. He didn't resist. He only looked up at her and said, calmly, "Even when you fight the wind, you can't stop it from blowing." She scoffed. "Save your riddles for court." As she escorted him out, she noticed people watching from their windows. A few were filming. Some looked angry. Others just shook their heads. Back at the station, Some of the officers clapped. "Good job, Williams," one of them said. "These people think they can scream at the sky all day and call it religion." Deborah felt proud. She filed the paperwork quickly, charged Pastor Marcus with public disturbance, and signed off on the church closure. By evening, a clip of her arrest had already made its way onto social media. Some praised her for keeping the streets quiet. Others called her a bully. But Deborah didn't care. She believed she was doing her job. She went to bed that night feeling victorious. What she didn't realize was that while she slept, something had already started in her body. A small red spot had appeared just below her left shoulder. She didn't notice it yet, but it was there, and it was spreading. The morning after the arrest, Deborah stood in front of the mirror getting ready for work. She was proud of how she looked in uniform. Her shirt was neatly ironed, her badge polished, her boots shining. But as she adjusted her collar, she paused. Something red peeked out from beneath the edge of her sleeve. She rolled it up. A small red patch, the size of a coin, sat quietly on her shoulder. It didn't hurt. It didn't itch. Just sat there, like a warning light that hadn't started blinking yet. She frowned. Weird. She rubbed it with some lotion, rolled the sleeve back down, and walked out the door. That day was unusually quiet. No complaints, no accidents, no arrests. She sat behind her desk at the station, sipping coffee, scrolling through articles about herself online. Most people had moved on from the church incident, but a few were still talking. One post read, "She arrested a man for praying? That's not law. That's control." She rolled her eyes and muttered, "People always complain when someone actually does the job." But her thoughts kept drifting, not to the comments, but to Pastor Marcus's words. Even when you fight the wind, you can't stop it from blowing. Why did that stick in her mind? It brought something back. Something from a time she had buried deep. Years ago, long before she wore a badge, Deborah was a little girl who sat at the edge of a church pew, swinging her feet, listening to her grandmother's voice singing hymns. Her grandmother, Mama Ruth, was the most faithful person she knew. She prayed morning and night. She gave food to strangers. She never missed a church service, even when she was sick. Deborah had loved those days. The sound of gospel music, the smell of fried dough after service, the way people held hands when they prayed. But that all changed the day Deborah's mother died. It was a car accident. Her mother was hit by a drunk driver on the freeway. Deborah was only 13. The driver survived. Her mother didn't. She remembered how Mama Ruth had cried, then dropped to her knees and started praying. Deborah was furious. "Why are you praying?" she screamed. "God didn't stop the car. He didn't save her. What are you thanking him for?" But her grandmother only said, "Even in pain, we must hold on to faith." That was the last time Deborah ever entered a church willingly. From that day on, she decided faith was for the weak. It didn't save her mother. It didn't fix the broken things. Rules, structure, law, those were real. Those had power. Prayer was just noise. That belief grew stronger as she grew older. She became disciplined, controlled, powerful. She joined the police. She followed every order, and she climbed the ranks faster than anyone expected. But now, standing in the locker room that evening, she rolled up her sleeve again and saw something that made her heart skip. The red patch had spread. It now stretched across her upper arm, like paint slowly dripping down. Still no pain. Still no itching. But it was there. Bigger. Angrier. She touched it gently. It felt warm. She didn't want to panic. She was never the type to run to the hospital over a skin reaction. "Maybe I'm just allergic to something," she whispered. She would give it a day. One day. But even as she buttoned up her sleeve again, something in her chest tightened. Something she hadn't felt in years. Fear. The next morning, Deborah woke up with a tightness in her arm. She sat up and immediately rolled back her sleeve. The red patch had spread again, now stretching past her elbow. It was no longer just a rash. It looked angry, swollen, like her skin was being pushed from inside. She sighed. "I'll see the station medic after roll call." But in truth, Deborah didn't like doctors. They asked too many questions. She believed in discipline and control, and illness, especially unexplained illness, made her feel weak. She didn't like feeling weak. At the station, her fellow officers didn't notice anything unusual. Deborah kept her jacket on the whole time. She gave orders, signed off reports, and walked through the corridors like a general in command. But deep inside, her thoughts were restless. Was it something she ate? Something she touched? She tried to focus on the day's work. An officer approached her. Ma'am, another prayer group is gathering near the bridge underpass. No permit. Just loud worship again. Want us to handle it? Deborah narrowed her eyes. No, I'll go. Personally. She grabbed her gear, ignoring the throb in her arm, and headed to the scene. When she arrived, about 10 people stood in a circle, heads bowed, holding hands. A young man strummed a guitar while a woman sang softly. No microphones. No loudspeakers. Just prayer. Deborah walked straight into the circle. You have no permit to gather here. The people stopped singing. The man with the guitar gently lowered it. We're not bothering anyone, officer, he said kindly. Just a moment of worship. City rules say public gatherings need permission. That includes religious ones. An older woman stepped forward. Officer, aren't there more serious crimes happening in this city than stopping prayer? Deborah flinched, not from the words, but from a sudden, sharp sting in her arm. She clenched her teeth. No exceptions, she said coldly. Pack it up or face a fine. The group slowly dispersed, murmuring among themselves. As she walked back to her car, the pain in her arm surged. She sat down heavily in the driver's seat and quickly rolled up her sleeve. Her breath caught. The rash was no longer red. It was turning purple. Veins around it looked inflamed, and her skin looked stretched. Swollen, like something inside was trying to come out. Still no fever. Still no explanation. She finally drove to the station medic. The nurse, Mr. Elroy, a middle-aged man with thick glasses and tired eyes, examined the rash. This is strange, he said. Just give me a cream. I have work to do. But Elroy shook his head. No, I'm referring you to the hospital. This isn't a normal allergic reaction. Deborah hated this. Hospitals meant waiting rooms. Needles. Questions. Tests. She didn't have time for that. Still, later that evening, she sat in a small examination room at Riverside General Hospital. Blood tests, skin samples, x-rays. The doctors said the same thing over and over. We're not sure what this is. No diagnosis. No infection. No sign of disease. You seem healthy, the young doctor said. But whatever this is, it's not reacting like any skin condition we've seen before. Back at home, Deborah lay on her couch in the dark, trying to stay calm. But her mind went back, again, to Pastor Marcus. That peaceful look on his face. That soft voice. Even when you fight the wind. She shook her head. This has nothing to do with him. Nothing to do with prayer. I'm sick. That's all. But deep inside, something disagreed. And that night, she woke up in a cold sweat. Because for the first time, she heard a voice. It wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from inside her. And it whispered, "You were warned." Deborah didn't sleep for more than 2 hours that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard that whisper again. It wasn't loud. It wasn't screaming. But it was there, low and steady, like someone breathing just behind her ear. You were warned. She kept sitting up and checking her apartment, turning on the lights, checking the windows. Nothing. No one was there. In the morning, her eyes were swollen from lack of sleep. But when she stood in front of the mirror, she saw something else that made her heart drop. Her stomach was swollen. Not like bloated from food, but puffed out, round, like she had gained weight overnight. Her uniform shirt didn't fit. The buttons wouldn't close properly. She grabbed her backup uniform, one size larger, and even that felt tight. What is happening to me? She whispered, touching her belly. It was firm, not soft like fat. It felt tense, as if something inside was pushing forward. She tried to stay calm. She was a police officer. She had seen worse things than this. Accidents, infections, all sorts of medical emergencies. But this wasn't someone else. This was her. Still, she pushed herself to go to work. She couldn't afford to let the department see her looking weak. She wore a long overcoat to hide the change and walked stiffly into the building. But as soon as she entered, people noticed something was off. You all right, ma'am? A junior officer asked. Fine, she replied quickly. But she could feel their eyes on her. The way she was walking. The slight swelling in her face. The redness in her eyes. She sat in her office and tried to distract herself with paperwork. She didn't want to think about the hospital, about the doctors shaking their heads, about the nurse who quietly whispered, I've never seen a rash like this in my 20 years. And now this swelling. It was spreading beyond her stomach. Her ankles were puffed. Her wrists, too. The rash on her arms had started forming tiny bumps, like little blisters, but without fluid. She finally pulled out her phone and looked at the photos she had taken over the last 2 days. Each day, the patches were bigger, the swelling worse. She zoomed in on the photo of her stomach from this morning. It looked unnatural. Suddenly, she remembered something from years ago. Her grandmother, Mama Ruth, had once told her, "When you disrespect what is sacred, your body may carry the weight of your words." Deborah had laughed at that back then. But now she didn't know what to believe. Around 2 p.m., her boss, Captain Rivera, called her in. "You don't look well, Deborah. I think you should take a few days off." "I'm fine," she insisted. "You're not," he said firmly. And honestly, with the videos still floating around of that church arrest, maybe some time away will help cool things off. That hit her harder than the symptoms. She had always been proud of being the station's strongest, most reliable officer. Now they were pushing her aside. She stood up without responding and left the building. Outside, people were walking to lunch, chatting, laughing. And that's when it happened. Ryup. The zipper of her coat burst open in front of everyone. Her stomach pushed forward like a balloon. Her arms were red and bumpy. Her face, tired and pale. People gasped. "Isn't that Officer Williams? She's the one who shut down that prayer church. Is she sick? No. Look at her. It's like her body is cursed." Phones came out. Cameras clicked. Some people crossed the street just to avoid her. Others just stared in shock. Deborah stood frozen, breathing heavily, her hands shaking. She tried to zip up her coat again, but the fabric was too tight. She couldn't hide what was happening. And for the first time in years, she wanted to cry. But before she could move, a small boy walking with his mother pointed and said, "Mommy, why is that police lady so swollen?" His mother pulled him close and whispered, "That's why we don't mess with people who pray." Deborah turned and walked away quickly, hiding her face. But she knew. This wasn't something she could control anymore. Something had started, and it wasn't stopping. By the time Deborah reached her apartment, her hands were trembling. She slammed the door behind her, ripped off her coat, and stood in front of the mirror again. Her reflection nearly made her step back. Her stomach was larger now, tight and round. Her arms looked like they had been sunburned, red and puffy. Her skin was dry and cracked in some places, and the rash now extended to her neck. Her face was pale, her lips dry. There were bags under her eyes from nights without sleep. She turned sideways and tried to suck in her stomach. It didn't move. It wasn't fat. It was something else. She grabbed her phone and opened social media. Bad idea. The top video on her feed was a shaky clip of her coat bursting open earlier that day. It already had over 20,000 views. People were reposting it with captions like, "That's what happens when you mock prayer. Officer Karma. God doesn't play." Comments flooded the page. "She deserves it. What if this is a sign? I feel bad for her. She used to be so strong. Why would a rash do all that? This is deeper." Deborah stared at the screen, lips pressed tight. She felt humiliated. All her years of discipline, all her awards and promotions, meant nothing now. One mistake, one moment of shutting down a church, and now the whole city was laughing at her. But deep down, was it really just a mistake? She turned off the phone and sat on the floor of her living room. For a moment, there was silence. Then knock, knock, knock. She jumped. Who would come to her apartment at this hour? When she opened the door, she saw her neighbor, Mrs. Torres, an elderly woman who had lived across the hall for nearly 20 years. She was holding a small plastic container and a look of concern. "I saw the video," she said gently. "I made you some soup." Deborah didn't know what to say. Mrs. Torres was known to be kind, but they never really spoke. "Thank you," Deborah whispered, taking the container. The woman hesitated, then asked, "Can I ask you something? Please don't get angry." Deborah nodded slowly. "Do you think what's happening to you could be spiritual?" Deborah stiffened. "I'm not cursed, if that's what people are saying." No, Mrs. Torres said quickly. "Not cursed. I just mean, maybe your body is crying out for something deeper, something you've been running from." Deborah didn't answer. She just stared at the soup. The neighbor smiled softly. "My son used to hate prayer too. He laughed at me every time I prayed for him. Until he got sick, badly sick. Doctors couldn't help. But the minute he opened his heart, things started to change." "I don't believe in that," Deborah said flatly. Mrs. Torres nodded. "Maybe not, but I'll still pray for you anyway." She left without another word. That night, Deborah sat in silence, sipping the soup. She didn't want to admit it, but something about Mrs. Torres's words stayed with her. What if she was right? What if this wasn't a medical issue? What if it was something deeper? Her phone buzzed. A news alert. Breaking. Officer behind church arrest under investigation for possible misconduct. She nearly dropped her bowl. It wasn't just her body falling apart now. Her entire career was slipping through her fingers. In the city? The city was watching. Across town, in a quiet office behind a row of shops, Pastor Marcus sat calmly, surrounded by microphones and cameras. It had been 2 weeks since his arrest, and now a popular online journalist had invited him to speak on a live stream. The title flashed across the screen. Persecuted Pastor Breaks Silence on Viral Police Incident. The room was simple. A Bible on the desk. A small cross on the wall. Marcus wore the same calm expression he had the day he was handcuffed. "Thank you for being here, Pastor," the host began. "The whole city has seen what happened to Officer Deborah Williams. People are saying it's justice. Others say it's a curse. How do you see it?" Pastor Marcus smiled gently. "I don't wish pain on anyone, especially not her. I don't believe God works through revenge. I believe he works through correction. So you think this is a lesson? I think when a heart is closed to mercy, sometimes the body carries the weight of that." The host leaned forward. "Do you think what's happening to Officer Williams is connected to her shutting down your church?" Marcus paused. "I think Deborah is not just dealing with something on her skin. I think her soul is asking questions she hasn't asked in years. This isn't about noise. It's about a wound deeper than the law can reach." The comment section exploded. "This man is speaking facts. She needs to hear this. I used to be like her, until my own life started falling apart." Back in her apartment, Deborah watched the clip in silence. She didn't want to, but the video had found its way to every major platform. It was trending, and her phone kept buzzing with people tagging her in it. She sat on her couch, face flushed, arms crossed over her swollen belly. "He talks like he knows me," she muttered. But she didn't turn it off. Marcus continued, his voice calm, never angry. "I remember Deborah from years ago," he said. "Her grandmother, Mama Ruth, used to bring her to my Sunday class when she was just a girl. She was sharp, curious, kind." Deborah blinked. He remembered. She hadn't seen Pastor Marcus in over 2 decades. "She lost her mother young," Marcus continued. "And after that, something inside her changed. She didn't just lose her mother. She lost her peace." The host nodded, clearly moved. "So, what would you say to her now, if she were watching?" Pastor Marcus looked into the camera. "I would say, you were never meant to carry the whole world on your own. You wear strength like armor, but even armor cracks under pressure. Let your heart speak again. It's not too late." Deborah turned off the screen. Her heart was pounding. How did he remember all that? How did he know what she was going through inside? She stood up and walked to the bathroom. Her reflection looked worse than yesterday. The rash had now reached her neck. The swelling on her stomach had increased. Her legs felt stiff. She touched her face gently. Then she whispered to herself, "It's not too late." But still, her pride fought back. "I don't need help," she said. "I just need answers." But as she lay in bed that night, something about Pastor Marcus's voice followed her into her dreams. And the whisper she heard in the darkness was no longer angry. It sounded sad. "You were never meant to carry it all." Deborah sat alone in the cold examination room at Riverside General for over 2 hours. Her body had grown worse since she watched Pastor Marcus's interview. Her arms were now covered in what looked like hardened red skin. Her legs felt heavy. Her stomach remained swollen, round and tight, like something was growing inside. But every test kept saying the same thing. Normal. No fever. No infection. No inflammation in her blood. The nurse had looked confused. The technician who ran her scans whispered to the doctor outside the door. Deborah could hear the muffled voices, concerned but unsure. Finally, Dr. Patel, a senior physician with tired eyes and a serious tone, stepped into the room with a folder in hand. "Officer Williams," he began, "we've run every test, blood work, imaging, dermatology panels. You're medically unremarkable. Everything looks normal." Deborah raised her eyebrows. "Does this look normal to you?" she said, pulling up her sleeves and motioning to her stomach. Dr. Patel sighed. "Visually, no. But internally, nothing is showing up. No signs of infection, no autoimmune activity, no organ enlargement. You're not even running a fever." "Then explain what's happening to me," she demanded. He paused. "I can't. And I hate saying that. But your symptoms don't match anything we've seen. I'll be honest, it's a medical mystery. Deborah stared at the wall. The words hit harder than a gunshot. You're telling me I'm falling apart, and you don't know why. I'm telling you there may be something happening to your body that our tests can't see. Yet, her mouth felt dry. She wanted to argue, to blame someone, but she didn't even know who. Herself? The system? Pastor Marcus? The doctor handed her a paper. This is a referral to a specialist. Immunology. Maybe they'll have more insight. But, between us, I'd also recommend talking to someone. Like a therapist? Like someone who knows your story. Sometimes the body reacts to unresolved trauma in ways we can't always explain. She didn't answer. She just folded the paper, stood up stiffly, and walked out of the room. As she stepped out into the hospital corridor, she noticed people looking at her again. Not just because of the viral videos. Now her condition was physically impossible to hide. Her uniform hung off her swollen frame awkwardly. Her hands were wrapped in gauze. Her neck showed clear signs of the spreading red marks. She avoided their eyes. She reached the hospital parking lot and sat inside her car, hands on the steering wheel, breathing heavily. Everything she'd built was slipping. Her career was under review. Her health was collapsing. The people she once arrested were praying for her recovery. And the whispers in her mind were louder now. Not strange voices, her own thoughts. But thoughts she hadn't allowed herself to hear in years. You think the badge protects you from everything. You're not in control anymore. What did you really lose when you turned away from faith? She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and closed her eyes. Her phone buzzed. Another news alert. Pastor Marcus's words sparked debate. Is Officer Deborah Williams facing divine consequences or medical coincidence? She turned off the phone. She didn't want to hear another theory, another opinion, another piece of noise. All she wanted was a cure, but no science could find one, and no part of her was willing, yet, to face the one place she had run from the most, herself. The following afternoon, Deborah stepped out of her apartment for the first time in 2 days. She had to. Her food was finished, and the specialist she had been referred to wouldn't return her calls. She wore her longest trench coat, dark sunglasses, and a scarf to hide the visible rash crawling up her neck. But even with all that, she couldn't hide the way her body moved. Slow, heavy, as if gravity had doubled its grip on her. Every step made her feel like the world was pressing down on her bones. She kept her head low as she walked to the pharmacy. Riverside City was as busy as ever. Car horns, the buzz of traffic, vendors shouting over each other. It was normal. Life moved on. But Deborah no longer felt like part of it. The moment she stepped into the pharmacy, the cashier froze. One of the customers whispered, "That's her. The officer with the condition." The girl at the counter smiled nervously. "Do you, need anything specific, ma'am?" "I need antihistamines. And something for inflammation," Deborah said, her voice low. The girl nodded, walked away quickly, and returned with 2 boxes. "Is this for your situation?" Deborah's jaw clenched. "Just ring it up." She paid and left the store, but the moment she stepped outside, disaster struck. As she moved through the crowd, a sudden gust of wind lifted her scarf slightly, revealing the full rash along her jawline. Someone gasped. "Hey, is that Deborah Williams?" The voice was too loud. People turned. "She's the officer who shut down that church." Phones came out. Click. Flash. Record. Deborah pulled her scarf tighter and hurried forward. But the sidewalk was narrow and crowded. Someone bumped her shoulder, and she lost balance for a second. Rip! The bottom hem of her coat caught on a bicycle handle. It tore upward, and for the second time in public, her body was exposed. Her stomach pushed against her shirt like a balloon. Her arms were swollen, red and bumpy. The bandages on her wrists were loose. Her legs were stiff, almost like she had trouble bending them. A woman screamed. A man backed away quickly, muttering, "She looks contagious." Deborah's eyes darted around. Dozens of people had their phones pointed at her now, recording, whispering, watching. She turned and ran, limping awkwardly as her swollen knees fought every step. Behind her, someone yelled, "That's what happens when you fight prayer." She finally reached an alleyway, leaned against the wall, and slid down slowly to the ground. Her breathing was heavy, her body pulsing with pain and shame. Tears filled her eyes. She hadn't cried in over 15 years, not since her mother's funeral. Not even when she was promoted to sergeant. Not when she held dying victims in her arms on patrol. But now, sitting on the cold cement, she wept. She cried not because of the pain, but because the world had seen her fall. They saw the strong, proud officer reduced to a trembling mess. They saw her body betray her. They saw her pride dissolve in front of a phone camera. For years, she thought her uniform gave her protection, respect, power. But now she realized, when that uniform was stripped away, when the badge could no longer command fear, all she had left was herself. And even that was falling apart. The city wasn't just watching now. It was judging, whispering, waiting to see what would happen next. And so was she. Deborah barely made it back to her apartment. Her coat was ripped. Her body ached. Her eyes were swollen from crying. She hadn't felt this exposed since childhood. But even worse than the shame was the silence that followed. The city outside didn't care anymore. The phones had recorded. The videos were posted. The laughter had already begun. Deborah Williams, the once feared officer, was now an internet spectacle. She turned off her phone completely. She didn't want to see one more comment. Not one more clip. Not one more reminder that she was no longer the image of strength she had worked her whole life to become. She locked the door and sat in the dark. She didn't eat. She didn't speak. She didn't move. Hours passed. Then, sometime after midnight, the whispers began again. At first, she thought it was a dream. Then she opened her eyes and realized she was awake. It wasn't a voice like something from a horror film. No, it was her own voice. Echoes of her past, memories she had locked away, now returning with a power that made her chest tighten. Why did you arrest that man? You call it law? Was it really justice? Do you remember the little girl who used to hold her grandmother's hand in church? She sat up, heart racing. Her bedroom was still. The only light was from the moon bleeding through the curtains. She could see her reflection in the mirror across the room. She didn't look like herself anymore. Not because of the swelling. Not the rashes. Her eyes. They were hollow. Not with fear, but with something deeper. Emptiness. She stood up and walked toward the mirror. Slowly, she peeled off the bandages from her wrists. The skin beneath was cracked, but healing strangely. The rash had stopped spreading, just slightly. For the first time in days, it wasn't worse. She ran her fingers along her stomach, still swollen and firm. It was the same. No better, but no worse. The voices grew softer. And then a memory. Her grandmother's voice, not in her imagination, but from a real day long ago. Deborah was 8. She had come home angry from school because another student had mocked her. She had wanted to fight back. But Mama Ruth had knelt beside her and said, "Baby, when your heart is too full of pride, there's no room left for peace. Don't carry your pain so tight. Let God help." Back then, Deborah rolled her eyes. Tonight, those words wrapped around her like a blanket. She lowered herself onto the floor, slowly, her joints stiff. She didn't pray. She didn't know how to anymore. But she closed her eyes and whispered into the darkness, "I don't know what to do." That was all. No long speech. No dramatic confession. Just truth. Raw, real, painful truth. And for the first time, the voices went completely silent. No whispers. No echoes. Just stillness. Outside, the city lights glowed as the traffic hummed in the distance. Inside, Deborah sat in the silence, afraid, broken, but beginning, just barely, to feel the weight in her chest shift. Not disappear, but shift. Something was happening. And though she didn't know it yet, this moment would be the quiet before the biggest storm of her life. The next morning, Deborah woke up on the floor. Her body was stiff, her neck sore, and her mouth dry. But her mind was strangely clear. The swelling hadn't gone away, but it hadn't worsened either. The rash still painted her arms and neck like a warning, but it wasn't burning like before. And for once, she hadn't heard any voices in the night. She climbed to her feet slowly, holding on to the edge of the bed. The weight of the past week sat on her shoulders like bricks, but today, she wasn't just tired. She was tired of pretending. She didn't have the strength to put on her uniform. She didn't want to. She stared at it hanging near the door, the sharp blue fabric that once gave her identity. Now, it looked like a costume from someone else's life. Around 9 a.m., her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She had turned it back on, bracing herself for what she might see. Missed calls, voicemails, messages. But one stood out, a message from Captain Rivera. "Please come in. We need to talk." Her heart dropped. She knew what that meant. Still, she dressed, sweatshirt, loose jeans, long sleeves, and headed to the station. Every step felt heavier than the last. When she arrived, no one greeted her. A few officers looked up from their desks, but no one smiled. They looked away quickly. The video of her public humiliation had done more damage than she imagined. When she entered Captain Rivera's office, he motioned for her to sit. Papers were spread across his desk. Her name was on most of them. "You don't look well, Deborah," he said calmly. "I'm getting through it," she replied. "No, you're not," he said. "Listen, I've known you for years. You've been one of the best officers this department has ever had. No one questions your loyalty. But right now you're not okay. And that's not something you can fix by pretending." She swallowed hard, but said nothing. Rivera leaned back in his chair. "There's pressure coming from the city board. The media's on fire. Half the town thinks you're a symbol of justice. The other half thinks you're being punished for silencing prayer." "I didn't break the law," Deborah said, her voice sharper than intended. "No," Rivera nodded. "You didn't. But you forgot something, Deborah. The law isn't always about being right. It's about being just. You followed the rule book, but you crushed something sacred to a lot of people. That has consequences." Deborah's eyes burned. Rivera slid a paper toward her. "Mandatory leave. Medical. You need to rest. And frankly, the department needs to breathe too." She stared at the paper. It felt like a quiet dismissal. No badge removal. No firing. Just a door closing slowly. "How long?" she asked. 30 days. Minimum. Maybe longer. She wanted to argue. To scream. To tell him she didn't need rest. She needed answers. But the pain in her back and legs reminded her that her body wasn't listening anymore. Rivera stood and walked to the door. "I hope you use this time to figure out what's going on. Not just with your health, but inside you." She left without saying another word. Outside the station, she didn't walk home. She just stood at the corner of 5th and Main, watching people pass by. Strangers. Tourists. Workers on break. They didn't know she was Officer Deborah Williams. And maybe they didn't care. For the first time in her adult life, she felt invisible. Not respected. Not feared. Just invisible. And for some reason, that scared her more than all the swelling, all the rashes, and all the voices she had heard. She had built her identity on being the one in charge. Now, she was a woman stripped of her power, her pride, and her uniform. What was left? She didn't know. But she had 30 days to find out. The first 3 days of Deborah's mandatory leave were quiet. Too quiet. She stayed home, took her pills, soaked in salt baths, and stared at the walls for hours. Her body still ached, the swelling remained, and the red rashes hadn't faded. But for now, they weren't getting worse. Yet, something else was shifting. The silence. Not outside, but inside her. The voices that used to echo in her head every night had gone quiet. Not because she had fixed anything, but because a different kind of discomfort was rising. A discomfort with herself. By the 4th day, she couldn't sit still anymore. She pulled on her hoodie, a scarf, long pants, and left her apartment. But this time, she wasn't headed to the pharmacy or the station. She was going home, the place where her story had started. Riverside's Hillview district was nothing like downtown. It was older, poorer, but full of character. This was where she grew up. This was where her grandmother, Mama Ruth, had raised her after her mother died. It had been over 10 years since she stepped into the neighborhood. The old chapel at the corner was still there, worn down, paint peeling, windows dusty. It used to be her grandmother's favorite place. The door creaked as she stepped in. It was empty. Not even a janitor in sight. The wooden pews were still lined in rows. The altar still stood at the front, though now covered in dust. A broken piano sat to one side, its keys yellowed with age. She walked slowly down the aisle, her boots echoing against the floor. She sat in the 3rd pew, the same one she used to sit in as a child next to Mama Ruth. Deborah lowered her hood. There were no cameras here. No uniform. No phone. No rank. Just her, and the silence. She stared at the cross on the wall. Not because she wanted to pray, but because she didn't know what else to do. She thought about her grandmother's voice. "Debbie, baby, don't fight life so hard. It's not about being strong all the time. Sometimes, strength is just letting go." She had never understood what that meant, until now. She didn't cry this time. But her heart was heavy. Heavy with regret. Heavy with confusion. Heavy with questions. Why had she grown so hard? Why had she silenced that church? Was it really about the noise? Or was it something else, something buried deeper? She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, and whispered into the dusty silence. "I'm lost, Grandma." The words surprised her. They weren't planned, but they were true. I don't know who I am anymore. I thought I was doing the right thing. I followed the rules. I kept people safe. But now, I don't know. People hate me. My body is falling apart, and I don't even recognize myself. She stared at the floor for a long time. Then, footsteps. Not imagined. Real. She turned. An elderly woman in a gray shawl stood in the back of the chapel. She was short, with tired eyes but a kind face. You used to come here with Ruth Williams, the woman said softly. Deborah stood slowly. Yes, I'm her granddaughter. The woman smiled sadly. She was a good woman. Always prayed for you. Deborah looked away, her throat tightening. I remember when she died. The woman continued. You didn't speak at the funeral. You stood in the back like a statue. I couldn't, Deborah said. I was angry. About what? Deborah paused, then said quietly, that she left me. The old woman nodded. We all lose people. But some of us never grieve properly. We just harden. Deborah met her eyes. What am I supposed to do now? The woman walked forward and placed a frail hand on her shoulder. Start where you left off. Come back to the place where your heart first closed, and open it, just a little. She left the chapel quietly, leaving Deborah standing in the pews. The city outside moved on, unaware of what had just been said inside the tiny church. But inside Deborah, something had shifted again. Not healed, not fixed, but opened, just a little. And sometimes, that's all it takes. By the next morning, Deborah noticed something strange. Her symptoms had plateaued. The swelling in her stomach remained, and the red rashes still covered parts of her arms and legs, but they weren't spreading anymore. Even more strange, she hadn't heard the night voices for 3 nights straight. But while the inner voices had grown quiet, the outside world had only grown louder. She had avoided the news for days, but now, even at the small corner pharmacy, her face was unavoidable. The local newspaper sat on a rack near the door with a headline that made her freeze. Praying too loud? Officer faces public outcry after church shutdown backfires. Below the headline was a blurry photo of her from that terrible day, her coat busting open, stomach swelling, people pointing. She quickly turned the paper over. But it was too late. The cashier had already recognized her. Hey, aren't you? Deborah didn't answer. She left the store, heart pounding. Back on the street, she kept her head down and moved fast, hoodie up, scarf tight. She had thought things would calm down. After all, people online usually forgot stories within a week. But this wasn't fading. If anything, it was growing. And the worst part? The silence from the department. She had expected Rivera to at least check in. But no one from the precinct had called since putting her on leave. She wasn't sure anymore if it was medical leave or silent punishment. Later that day, she received an unexpected visitor. She had barely sat down on the couch when someone knocked. Her heart jumped. She wasn't expecting anyone. She hesitated, then opened the door halfway. Standing there was a young man in a black jacket holding a notebook and a press badge. Good afternoon, Officer Williams, he said. Or should I say, Deborah? I'm Theo Mendez, local reporter for City Pulse. Can I ask you a few questions? Her first instinct was to slam the door in his face. But he didn't seem smug like most reporters. He looked curious and tired. No, she said firmly. I'm not doing interviews. I get that, he replied. But people are talking. And what they're saying isn't the full story. They're calling you cursed. Some say it's karma. Others think it's fake. Deborah rolled her eyes. You believe that nonsense? I don't know what I believe, Theo said honestly. But I believe this. Your story's being twisted. And if you don't speak, others will keep writing it for you. She stood quietly. He continued, I've seen viral lies ruin people. If even one detail is wrong, the whole city will believe it. And from what I hear, you were just doing your job. She narrowed her eyes. What do you think I did? Theo paused. I think you followed the law, but maybe missed the heart behind it. That stung. Because it was true. He handed her his card. I'm not here to expose you. I'm here to listen, if you ever feel ready. Then he walked away. Deborah stared at the card. Theo Mendez, investigative reporter. She set it on the table and sank onto the couch. The world outside had judged her already. But now, for the first time, someone wanted her side of the story. And the question she couldn't escape was this. Would telling the truth help heal? Or would it make everything worse? The card sat on her coffee table for 2 days. Theo Mendez. It glared at her like an invitation and a warning all at once. Deborah wasn't sure what scared her more, what she might say, or what the world might do with her words. Her symptoms weren't improving, but they weren't getting worse either. Still, she couldn't shake the unease. It felt like her entire life was paused, dangling somewhere between the past she couldn't erase and the future she couldn't imagine. She spent most of the day lying on the couch, television on, volume low. The news played, but she wasn't really listening, until something caught her ear. More controversy surrounding Officer Deborah Williams continues, as public petitions grow to have her removed from duty permanently. Her heart dropped. The screen showed a crowd outside City Hall. Some carried signs, "Freedom to worship. No more abuse of power," while others shouted into cameras. But one clip stood out. It showed a woman, middle-aged, gentle-eyed, speaking calmly to reporters. "I don't hate the officer. I really don't. But the way she came into our church that day, it was like we weren't people to her. Just noise. I still remember the look in her eyes, cold, like we were criminals. That's what hurt the most." Deborah turned the TV off. Silence. And then shame. She had told herself she was just doing her job, that the law didn't care about feelings, only order. But now she wasn't so sure. Was it possible to be right by law and wrong as a human being? Later that evening, she stood in front of the mirror. The rash had turned darker in some places, and her belly was still swollen, as if something unnatural lived beneath her skin. Her eyes looked sunken, her skin pale. She didn't look like a police officer anymore. She looked like someone being stripped down, layer by layer, until nothing was left but truth. She turned away from the mirror and picked up Theo's card. Then she called the number. It rang 3 times before his voice answered. "Hello. It's Deborah." A pause. "I wasn't sure you'd call." "I'm not sure why I did," she said honestly. "I can come to you," he offered. "No cameras. Just a notebook." "No," she said. "I'll come to you." Neutral ground. They agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop near the river, just before sunset. When Deborah arrived, she wore sunglasses and a scarf, careful not to draw attention. Theo was already there, waiting with a notebook and 2 coffees. She sat down slowly, already feeling exposed. He smiled gently. "You okay?" "No," she replied. "But I'm here." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Theo asked, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Off the record." She nodded. "What made you go so hard after that church?" She looked down, took a deep breath, then answered slowly, "Because it reminded me of something I'd spent years trying to forget." He didn't interrupt. He waited. "I grew up in church," she said. "My grandmother raised me there. But when she died, and things got hard, I blamed everything connected to her, including prayer. I told myself it was all emotional nonsense. I closed that door, locked it, and I swore I'd never open it again." Theo jotted something down, then looked up. "So when you heard that church praying loudly, it felt like noise," she whispered. "But really, it was memory. And I hated how it made me feel, weak. I couldn't control it." Theo leaned forward. "Deborah, people don't need perfect officers. They need honest ones. Your story could change how people see this." She looked at him. "I'm not ready for people to see me." "You're already being seen," he said gently. "Wouldn't you rather control what they see?" She didn't respond. Because deep inside, she knew this wasn't just about telling the truth to the public. It was about finally telling the truth to herself. And that was the hardest story of all. Deborah didn't sleep that night. After meeting with Theo, she lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, mind racing. Her body still throbbed in places, the rash still flared like wildfire across her legs, and the swelling in her stomach remained, foreign and heavy. But the real pain wasn't physical anymore. It was truth. She had spent years building up walls, around her heart, her past, and even her memories of God. Her badge had become armor. Her uniform had become her identity. Now, without it, what was left? Around 3 a.m., she finally got up, wrapped herself in a coat, and stepped out onto the balcony of her apartment. The city was quiet. Cars rolled by far below. Distant sirens echoed across the skyline. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked. But for the first time in years, she could hear herself breathe. Then the phone rang. It startled her. She checked the screen. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello." The voice was thin and elderly. Familiar. "Deborah." She froze. "Who is this?" she asked cautiously. "It's Mother Joanna, from your grandmother's church. I heard you came to visit." Deborah said nothing. Her throat tightened. I was sitting up praying tonight, the woman continued. And your name came to me. I just wanted to tell you, you're not alone. I don't know what's happening to your body, child, but I know this. What you're facing isn't punishment. It's a wake-up call. Tears filled Deborah's eyes. Why now? Because some things don't break until we stop running. And I think you've stopped running. Deborah tried to speak, but no words came. I'm praying for you, the old woman said softly. Not for healing of your skin, but for healing of your soul. The call ended. She stood there, holding the phone to her chest, shaking, not from fear, but from release. She had spent her whole life thinking strength meant being hard. But now, in the middle of the night, wrapped in a blanket, skin covered in rashes, heart wide open, she was learning what strength really meant. It meant breaking, not once, but over and over again. Later that day, she opened her inbox. She hadn't checked her email in days. There were dozens of messages. News outlets, curious citizens, hate mail, supporters, even strangers. But one stood out. The subject line read, "We forgive you, from the church you shut down." Her heart stopped. She opened it slowly. Dear Officer Deborah, we were shocked by what happened that day. And honestly, many of us were angry. But after watching everything unfold and hearing that you visited Hillview, we realized something important. You're not our enemy. You're one of us. We're praying for you. We forgive you. And if you ever want to talk, or just sit quietly, the door is open. Pastor Marcus and Riverside Worship Group. She read the email 3 times. Then she began to cry. Not the quiet, graceful kind, but the messy, shaking, ugly cry that breaks something deep. She cried for her grandmother. She cried for the little girl who sat in the 3rd pew. She cried for every time she hardened her heart instead of facing her grief. Then, finally, she whispered to herself, maybe I was wrong. And that, more than any public apology or statement, was the beginning of something new. But healing, Deborah was learning, doesn't come in one moment. It comes in pieces. Painful, powerful, personal pieces. And her journey was far from over. The next morning, Deborah did something she hadn't done in years. She turned off her phone and sat in complete silence. No news. No sirens. No patrol calls. No angry citizens. No emails. Just silence. She sat by her window, the rays of early sunlight spilling across her living room floor. She watched the way the light moved slowly up the wall, the way the dust floated in the air, the way the city seemed to breathe just below her. For years, she had hated silence. Silence meant memories. Silence meant guilt. Silence meant the things she refused to confront. But now, silence was becoming her mirror, and it was showing her things she didn't want to see, but needed to. She touched her stomach gently. The swelling hadn't gone down, but it hadn't worsened either. The rashes still itched. She had gotten used to the discomfort, but what she hadn't gotten used to was the look in people's eyes. Pity, judgment, fear. Her reputation was no longer what it used to be. She wasn't Deborah Williams, officer in charge of Zone 3. She was the woman who shut down a church and became a mystery. Some people said she deserved it. Some whispered that God was teaching her a lesson. And some, like Theo and Pastor Marcus, believed she still had a chance to change the story. Later that afternoon, she decided to leave her apartment. It was risky, but she couldn't stay locked inside forever. She put on a hat, sunglasses, and a long coat to hide the rash marks on her hands. She walked down to a small park not far from her building. There weren't many people there, just a few kids playing, an old man feeding birds, and a young woman sitting under a tree with a Bible on her lap. Deborah froze when she saw the Bible. She turned to walk away, but then stopped. Something inside her told her to stay. She walked to a bench nearby and sat down. For several minutes, she just watched the young woman under the tree, wondering what it was like to believe without doubt, to carry something like faith in broad daylight without shame. Suddenly, the woman looked up and noticed Deborah watching. She smiled. Deborah quickly looked away. But a moment later, the woman stood up and walked over. "Hi," she said, voice warm. "I don't mean to bother you, but are you okay?" Deborah hesitated. "I'm fine. You look like you needed someone to talk to." Deborah almost snapped back with something harsh. But something in the woman's eyes made her pause. They were calm, patient. "I've been better," she admitted. The woman nodded. "Would you like me to pray for you?" Deborah's chest tightened. Her instinct screamed, "No. Walk away. You don't need that." But her heart whispered something different. She nodded slowly. The woman didn't ask her name. She didn't ask for details. She just reached out, gently placed her hand on Deborah's shoulder, and whispered a quiet prayer that was so sincere, it made Deborah's eyes sting. Lord, the woman said, this woman is tired and hurting, but you haven't forgotten her. Remind her that even when the world misjudges her, you see her completely, and you still love her. Amen. When she finished, Deborah couldn't speak. She just whispered, thank you. The woman smiled again. You're welcome. You're not alone, you know. Then she walked away. Deborah sat there for a long time, tears slipping down her cheeks. Not because the prayer fixed her, not because the swelling disappeared, but because, for the first time in weeks, someone saw her as human again. And in a city full of noise, fear, and judgment, that meant more than she could say. Deborah had always believed that control was her greatest strength. She kept her life in tight order, her routines, her reports, her rules. Even when others panicked, she remained calm, unshaken, calculated. But now, her body didn't listen to her anymore. Her reputation wasn't hers to protect, and even her thoughts felt like they belonged to someone else. She sat at the kitchen table the next morning, staring at a cup of untouched tea. Her appetite was gone again, and the rash on her arms had started to spread to her neck. The swelling in her stomach was still there, hard, tight, unexplainable. And the worst part? The dreams. Every night now, she heard faint voices in her sleep, chanting, sometimes calling her name, sometimes repeating things she used to say as a child in church. God is my refuge. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. Let your light shine. Each morning, she woke up sweating, breathless. The dreams weren't scary in the usual way. They weren't monsters, or chases, or falling. They were reminders. Reminders of who she used to be. And maybe, who she was still supposed to become. But she wasn't ready for that. She needed answers. So that afternoon, she went to the city hospital for another appointment with Dr. Sani, the same physician who had first examined her weeks ago. This time, she didn't hide her fear. She walked into the office slowly, face pale, hat removed, long sleeves rolled up to reveal the full spread of the rash. Dr. Sani looked startled. Deborah, this is worse than I expected. I can't keep pretending, she said, voice low. What is this? Tell me something. The doctor sighed, flipping through the file. Your blood work is still clean. Your organs are stable. There's no sign of infection. No allergies. No underlying disease we can point to. Then why do I look like this? She demanded, her voice cracking. I don't know, he admitted, frustration in his voice. But it's not medical, not in the traditional sense. He paused, then lowered his voice. You ever consider talking to someone? Like a counselor? Maybe even a pastor? Deborah flinched. You think this is in my head? No, he said firmly. I think the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. And sometimes, we carry wounds that no X-ray can find. She stared at him. That simple statement hit her harder than any diagnosis. Because deep down, she knew he was right. She was carrying something inside her, something emotional, spiritual, maybe even moral, that no medicine could treat. On her way out of the hospital, she passed a chapel built into the hospital's east wing. It was small, barely lit. She almost walked by, but she stopped, looked at the door, then, slowly, pushed it open. The chapel was empty. Wooden pews. A plain cross on the wall. Soft music playing from unseen speakers. She walked inside and sat in the back, feeling like a stranger in a place she once called home. She didn't pray. She just sat. After a few minutes, the door creaked open and a janitor walked in. A small, quiet man in his 60s with kind eyes and a gentle gait. He looked at her, but didn't speak. Just began sweeping near the front. Deborah watched him. Something about the way he moved, calm, unrushed, peaceful, made her envy him. She finally stood and whispered, Sir? He turned to her. Yes, ma'am. Do you believe God punishes people this way? The janitor leaned on his broom and looked at her carefully. No. I believe God wakes people up this way. She blinked. Wakes them up to what? To whatever they've been sleeping on, he said with a shrug. Anger, pride, fear, the need to be in control. He shakes it loose, so you can breathe again. Deborah didn't say anything. She just nodded. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe. Maybe this wasn't the end of her story. Maybe it was the beginning. It had been 3 days since Deborah visited the hospital chapel. 3 days of silence. No officers at her door. No reporters hounding her. No physical changes. For the first time, her condition had stopped getting worse. But it hadn't gotten better either. The swelling in her stomach remained, tight and pressing. The rashes had paused, but didn't fade. Her body still itched. Her sleep still came in broken pieces. And the dreams, well, now they included her grandmother. In those dreams, the old woman sat by the edge of Deborah's childhood bed, singing old hymns softly. What a friend we have in Jesus. And every time Deborah reached out to touch her, she woke up. It was mid-morning when she heard the knock at her door. She wasn't expecting anyone. Cautiously, she peered through the peephole. Her breath caught in her throat. Standing on the other side was Pastor Marcus, the man she had arrested, the man whose church she shut down, the man who had written her the forgiveness letter. She opened the door slowly. He smiled gently. "Good morning, Officer Williams. You came all the way here. May I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, she offered him water, but he politely declined. He sat on the couch, his Bible resting on his lap, though he hadn't opened it. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Deborah said, "Why are you here?" "Because when someone falls, they don't need critics. They need companions," he said calmly. Deborah looked away. "You shouldn't forgive me that easily." "We didn't say it was easy," he said. "Forgiveness is never easy. But it's necessary." She sighed. "I didn't mean to hate you. I was doing my job." He nodded. "I believe that. But sometimes, the system makes us forget the people behind the noise. You forgot us, and maybe, somewhere along the way, you forgot yourself too." Those words cut through her like a knife. She looked down at her swollen stomach. "I'm not the same anymore. Not just on the outside. Inside, something's breaking." "Good," Pastor Marcus said softly. Deborah's head snapped up. "Good." He nodded. "Sometimes God can't reach us until we break. Not because he's cruel, but because we won't let him touch the parts we keep hidden." Deborah looked at him with weary eyes. "But why me? Why like this?" Pastor Marcus leaned forward. "Because your voice is loud, Deborah, and your silence was even louder. Now the world is listening. You can either stay quiet or speak from a place of truth." She swallowed hard. "What would I even say? Tell them what you're learning." She was quiet. "I'm not ready," she whispered. "You don't have to be. You just have to be willing." They sat together in silence again. Then Pastor Marcus stood. "Before I go, may I pray for you?" She didn't trust her voice, so she just nodded. He placed his hand on her shoulder gently, and for the first time in years, she bowed her head. "Father, thank you for Deborah. For her strength, even in this storm. For her honesty, even in fear. Heal what medicine can't. Restore what time has worn. And let her know, she is still yours. Amen." Tears rolled down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them. After he left, Deborah stood by the window and watched him walk away. Her mind kept replaying one word. Willing. She wasn't healed. She wasn't whole. But maybe she was willing. And maybe that was enough for now. That night, Deborah didn't sleep. Not because of pain. Not because of the voices or dreams. But because she had made a decision. She wasn't going to wait for her body to heal before she started speaking. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She was tired of being a symbol of disgrace or fear. She wanted to become something else, a voice of reflection. So, the next morning, she did something bold. She opened her old laptop, dusted off the keyboard, and recorded a video. No makeup, no uniform, just her, in her home, with tired eyes and a trembling voice. The camera lens made her nervous, but she pushed through. She began, "My name is Officer Deborah Williams. Some of you may know me. Most of you probably know the stories going around, about what happened to me, about what I did." She took a deep breath. Her hands were shaking. "I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to be honest. I used to believe that enforcing the law meant silencing people when they got too loud, even if that loudness was prayer. I shut down a church. I arrested a man of faith. And I did it thinking I was helping the city." She paused and wiped her face. "But then something happened. To my body, yes, but more deeply, to my soul. Doctors can't explain it. Maybe they never will. But this isn't about illness anymore. It's about what happens when you ignore your conscience long enough. It starts speaking to you in other ways." She looked directly into the camera. "I was wrong." She let that sit. "I let pride, fear, and power blind me. And now, I'm listening. To people I once silenced. To a voice I used to believe in as a child. To the same faith I mocked in others." She reached up and unwrapped the bandage on her arm. Red rashes still covered her skin. "This is what the outside looks like," she said. "But inside, something's starting to heal. It's slow, but it's real." She ended the video without any dramatic finish. No plea for sympathy. No hashtags. No viral intentions. Just truth. And then, she hit upload. She didn't tell anyone. But by noon, her inbox was full. Some messages were cruel. Some accused her of faking it. Others called her weak. But most were from people saying thank you. Thank you for being honest. Thank you for showing that strong people can change. Thank you for proving it's never too late to learn. She even got an email from a fellow officer named Tanya who admitted, "I've always wanted to speak up when I saw the system breaking people. But I was afraid. You've given me a little courage." And that did something to Deborah. It reminded her that her story was no longer just hers. It was becoming part of something larger, something that challenged others to reflect. That evening, she received a surprise knock again. When she opened the door, it was Theo, the junior officer. He smiled awkwardly. "Saw your video," he said. "Didn't know whether to salute or hug you." She laughed, a real laugh for the first time in weeks. "You okay?" he asked. "Not yet," she replied. "But I'm not pretending anymore." "That's a start." Theo reached into his bag and pulled out a small brown envelope. Theo handed her the small brown envelope without saying a word. Deborah held it in her hands, confused. It had her name on it, written in neat cursive handwriting. She opened it slowly and pulled out a photograph and a short letter. The photo was old, one of her as a little girl, standing beside her grandmother in front of the neighborhood church. Both of them were smiling brightly. In the corner, written in faded ink, were the words, "Never forget who you are." Deborah stared at it for a long time. The letter was from an anonymous sender. No name, no signature, just a few lines. "You were chosen to carry more than a badge. You were chosen to carry light. The city needs your strength, but now, it needs your humility more. Use your pain. Tell the truth. And never forget where your story really began." She blinked. Her eyes stung. "How did you get this?" she asked Theo. "It was in the Dropbox outside the station," he replied. "No return name. But it had your name written bold." Deborah didn't know what to say. "People are listening, Deborah," Theo added. "You may have started this as a story of punishment. But now, it's turning into a story of possibility." Later that night, Deborah sat on her couch, holding the photo against her chest. She didn't feel healed, but she didn't feel broken anymore, either. She felt open. And for a woman who had spent her entire life in control, that was the biggest transformation of all. Outside her window, the city pulsed as always. Cars honking, lights flashing, people moving. Life never stopped in Riverside. But somewhere in the noise, someone was watching her video. Someone else was forwarding it to a friend. Someone was being reminded that even the toughest people can change. And just like that, the ripple grew. But back inside her apartment, Deborah leaned back and whispered to herself, almost like a prayer, "If only I had known. I would have let them be." She looked at her reflection in the dark screen of her laptop. And for the first time in years, she saw herself again. To be continued. Tell us where you are watching from. Don't forget to like, comment, and share our stories to your loved ones.